What happens when a late-night comedy interview suddenly turns into a tense conversation about power, politics, and secret deals that could reshape the world? And what happens when one guest dares to say the quiet part out loud on live television? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the Truth Narrator, like this video, and leave a comment below. Because today's story is one that left viewers stunned, sparked fierce debates online, and raised questions that are still echoing far beyond the television studio. The lights inside the Ed Sullivan Theater glowed brightly. The audience was energized. The music was loud. Everything felt normal. It was supposed to be another entertaining night on late-night television. Stephen Colbert walked confidently onto the stage as applause thundered through the room. The host smiled, soaking in the energy of the crowd. For most viewers watching from home, this was familiar territory. A few laughs, a few jokes, maybe some political commentary. Nothing unusual. At least, that's what everyone thought. Because waiting backstage was a guest whose reputation had been built on understanding the dangerous world behind headlines. A journalist, a political analyst, someone who spent years studying the complicated relationship between the United States and Russia. Julia Ioffe. As her name was announced, the crowd welcomed her warmly. She smiled. She waved. She took her seat. But almost immediately, the atmosphere began to change. The conversation wasn't headed toward celebrity gossip. It wasn't about movies. It wasn't about entertainment. It was about power. And power always makes people uncomfortable. Colbert leaned forward. The smile on his face remained, but his question carried a sharper edge. "You understand international affairs better than most people," he began. The audience listened carefully. Then he mentioned the latest controversy surrounding Venezuela, a controversy that had already ignited heated arguments across political circles. The question hung in the air. What exactly did it mean when politicians talked about running another country? For a moment, Julia paused. Then she delivered an answer that instantly triggered laughter throughout the studio. "Well, he did notify the oil companies." The audience erupted. Colbert laughed. Julia smiled. For a brief second, the tension disappeared. But beneath the laughter was something else. Something darker. The joke had landed because everyone understood the implication. Oil, influence, control, the subjects that often lurk behind international conflicts. Colbert pushed deeper. He questioned how such an operation could even work. Wouldn't it require enormous resources, massive military involvement, years of commitment? The kind of commitment that history had already shown could spiral into disaster? Julia listened carefully. Then she responded, and suddenly the conversation became much more serious. She suggested that perhaps the strategy wasn't about military occupation at all. Maybe the goal was influence, pressure, leverage, the ability to shape decisions without officially taking control. As she explained the idea, the audience's laughter slowly faded. People shifted in their seats, because now they weren't listening to jokes. They were listening to possibilities. And possibilities can sometimes feel more unsettling than facts. Colbert nodded. The host's expression had changed. He was still smiling, but now there was curiosity behind it. The kind of curiosity that appears when a conversation starts heading somewhere unexpected. Then came a moment that made the audience react instantly. Colbert joked about installing a puppet leader. The room exploded with laughter. Yet beneath the joke was an uncomfortable truth. Nobody likes hearing discussions about power reduced to such blunt language. Because once the euphemisms disappear, the reality becomes harder to ignore. Julia laughed. The audience laughed. But many viewers at home were beginning to realize something. This wasn't simply comedy anymore. This was a discussion about how nations operate behind closed doors, about what governments say publicly, and what critics believe happens privately. Then came the line that changed the energy completely. Julia looked toward Colbert and said something that caught everyone off guard. She suggested that perhaps what made the situation unusual wasn't the behavior itself. Maybe what was unusual was the honesty. The audience fell quiet. For a second, just a second, but it was enough. Because suddenly the conversation had shifted from one administration to something much bigger. A question about history itself. She argued that powerful countries often justify their actions with noble language, democracy, freedom, security. But critics around the world sometimes see different motivations, resources, influence, strategic interests. And now, she suggested, perhaps someone was simply saying those motivations out loud. The audience reacted with a mix of laughter and surprise. Even Colbert seemed intrigued. "So it's refreshing in its corruption?" he asked jokingly. The crowd burst into laughter again. Julia laughed too, but the question lingered. Refreshingly honest or alarmingly honest? The distinction depended entirely on who was watching. Across social media, clips from the interview were already beginning to spread. Viewers posted snippets. Commentators weighed in. Supporters and critics rushed to interpret every sentence. And yet the most explosive part of the conversation hadn't even happened yet, because Colbert was about to bring up a topic that would transform the interview from a discussion about Venezuela into something far larger. Russia, Ukraine, Donald Trump, and allegations involving secret diplomatic signals exchanged behind the scenes. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were only moments away from hearing a theory that connected multiple countries, multiple administrations, and years of geopolitical tension. A theory involving influence, negotiation, and what some believe could be one of the most controversial diplomatic ideas ever floated. As Colbert prepared his next question, Julia sat calmly in her chair. The crowd settled down. The laughter faded. The stage lights reflected across the studio. And suddenly the entire room felt different, because everyone sensed the same thing. The real conversation was just beginning, and what happened next would leave viewers talking long after the cameras stopped rolling. The laughter was gone now, not completely. A few chuckles still drifted through the studio whenever Stephen Colbert delivered one of his trademark jokes. But something had changed. The audience could feel it. The conversation had crossed an invisible line. Moments earlier, everyone had been discussing Venezuela. Now the discussion was about to become much larger, much riskier, much more controversial. Colbert adjusted himself in his chair and looked directly at Julia Ioffe. His next question wasn't delivered with the playful energy that had filled the first half of the interview. Instead, it carried the weight of unfinished history. There was testimony during Trump's first impeachment. He began carefully. The audience immediately grew quieter. Even those who weren't political experts recognized the significance of the subject. The first impeachment, Ukraine, Russia, names and events that had dominated headlines for years. Colbert continued. He referenced testimony from Fiona Hill, a respected foreign policy expert who had served in government and later testified before Congress. According to Hill, there had once been discussions about a possible geopolitical understanding involving Venezuela and Ukraine. Not an official agreement, not a signed document, but an idea, a possibility, a suggestion, something whispered rather than declared. As Colbert spoke, audience members leaned forward. The atmosphere inside the theater became noticeably more intense, because everyone understood where this was heading. The idea was simple, maybe too simple. Russia would ease its involvement in Venezuela. The United States would reduce pressure involving Ukraine. Each side would focus on what it considered its own sphere of influence. You stay out of our backyard. We'll stay out of yours. The theory sounded almost shocking when spoken aloud, not because it was confirmed, but because it resembled the kind of calculations that people imagine happening behind closed diplomatic doors, the kind of conversations ordinary citizens rarely get to hear. Colbert paused. Then he asked the question, "Is there anything to that?" The room became silent. Every eye turned toward Julia. This was the moment viewers would later clip, replay, and debate online. Julia considered her answer carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, measured, professional, but her explanation immediately added a new layer of intrigue. She said there had never actually been a formal deal, no signed arrangement, no direct exchange, at least not according to what was publicly known. Instead, she described something far more subtle. Hints, signals, suggestions, political breadcrumbs scattered where influential people might notice them. The audience listened closely. According to Julia, Russian officials had allegedly been sending messages that carried a simple implication. Venezuela mattered deeply to the United States because of geography. Ukraine mattered deeply to Russia for similar reasons. Maybe each side should acknowledge those realities. That's a deal. The audience laughed. The tension briefly broke. But Julia wasn't finished. No, she replied. Then she explained why. In her view, officials handling foreign policy during that period had not accepted the suggestion. Key figures had different priorities. Meanwhile, social media had erupted. Clips from the interview were spreading rapidly. Some viewers praised Julia's analysis. Others challenged it. Political commentators jumped into the conversation. Journalists posted reactions. Supporters and critics interpreted the discussion through entirely different lenses. One 30-second clip became a minute. 1 minute became several. Soon the interview existed far beyond the walls of the theater. And yet inside the studio, the conversation continued. The audience remained captivated because they sensed that they were witnessing something unusual. Not a shouting match, not a scandal, not an angry confrontation. Something more subtle. A collision between comedy and geopolitics, between entertainment and global power. Colbert understood how unusual the moment had become. His questions remained sharp, but he allowed Julia space to explain complex ideas. And Julia, for her part, never raised her voice. She didn't need to. The subject matter carried enough weight on its own. As the exchange unfolded, a remarkable contrast emerged. On one side sat a comedian whose job was to make audiences laugh. On the other sat a journalist whose expertise involved understanding international conflict. Yet somehow their conversation had become one of the most talked about political discussions of the week. The audience could feel that significance. Each response generated a new reaction. A laugh, a gasp, a murmur, a moment of silence. The emotional rhythm shifted constantly. 1 second humorous, the next unsettling, the next thought-provoking, the next controversial. And that unpredictability kept everyone engaged. Nobody knew exactly where the discussion would go next. Nobody knew which quote would dominate headlines. Nobody knew which moment would become the viral clip shared across countless platforms. But everyone knew they were watching something memorable. As the interview approached its conclusion, the tension remained. Questions lingered. Possibilities remained unresolved. The audience had not received definitive answers. In many ways, they had received more questions than answers. Yet that uncertainty was precisely what made the conversation powerful. Because certainty ends discussions. Questions keep them alive. When the cameras prepared to cut away for a commercial break, Colbert glanced toward the audience. The energy inside the room was unmistakable. People weren't simply entertained. They were engaged, thinking, processing, debating. The conversation had transformed from a television interview into something larger, a national discussion, an online battle, a cultural moment. And neither Colbert nor Julia could fully predict what would happen after the broadcast ended, because outside the studio walls, millions of viewers were already reacting, journalists were already writing, commentators were already arguing, and social media was preparing to do what it always does. Turn a single conversation into a global controversy. The cameras were about to stop recording, but the real drama was only beginning. The cameras stopped rolling. The audience applauded. The band played. Stephen Colbert thanked his guest. Julia Ioffe smiled politely. And for those sitting inside the theater, it seemed like the evening had come to a natural conclusion. Just another interview. Just another episode. Just another night of television. But outside the studio walls, something very different was happening. The moment the broadcast ended, clips from the conversation began appearing online. At first, it was the humorous moments, the jokes about oil, the sarcastic remarks, the audience laughter. People shared them for entertainment. Memes appeared within minutes. Short clips spread across social media feeds. Viewers laughed, commented, scrolled, shared. But then the more serious sections began circulating. The discussion about Venezuela, the references to Ukraine, the conversation about geopolitical bargaining. the possibility of powerful nations quietly negotiating spheres of influence. Suddenly, the mood changed. What had started as entertainment transformed into debate, and debate transformed into controversy. Across social media platforms, thousands of users rushed to share their opinions. Some viewers praised Julia's analysis. They argued that she had offered an honest look at how international politics often operates behind the scenes. Others strongly disagreed. They accused commentators and journalists of speculating too much, of drawing conclusions from incomplete information, of presenting theories that could never be fully verified. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful television moments aren't the loudest ones. They're the conversations that quietly challenge assumptions, the moments that make audiences pause. The interview became a reminder that beneath every headline lies a deeper story. Beneath every political statement lies another layer. And beneath every public debate lies a struggle to understand what is really happening behind closed doors. The audience that night arrived expecting entertainment. What they received was something far more memorable. A conversation that blurred the line between comedy and reality. A discussion that transformed a television segment into a national debate. And a moment that proved how quickly a few words spoken on a brightly lit stage can echo across the entire world. But now the question moves from them to you. What do you think? Was this simply a fascinating political discussion? Or did the interview reveal something deeper about the way power operates on the global stage? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could be completely different from everyone else's. And that's exactly what makes these conversations important. And if you enjoyed this dramatic deep dive into one of television's most talked about interviews, make sure you subscribe to the Truth Narrator, turn on notifications, and join us for more explosive stories, shocking confrontations, hidden tensions, and unforgettable moments that leave the world talking long after the cameras stop rolling. Because sometimes the biggest drama doesn't happen in movies. Sometimes it happens live, right in front of everyone. And those are the stories we're here to tell.